just wondered if Marjorie would be so very pleased to meet her. I hadn't seen Marjorie near too, but in the distance she looked dowdy and extra prim and proper. Well, of course, it was not any of my business, but you can get very queer little glimpses of life sometimes. You can't help speculating about them. From where they were standing, I could just catch fragments of their conversation that floated down to me. They were talking about bathing. The husband, whose name seemed to be Dennis, wanted to take a boat and row round the coast. There was a famous cave well worth seeing, so he said, about a mile along. Carol wanted to see the cave too, but she suggested walking along the cliffs and seeing it from the land side. She said she hated boats. In the end, they fixed it that way. Carol was to go along the cliff path and to meet them at the cave, and Dennis and Marjorie would take a boat and row round. Hearing them talk about bathing made me want to bathe too. It was a very hot morning, and I wasn't doing particularly good work. Also, I fancied that the afternoon sunlight would be far more attractive in effect. So I packed up my things and went off to a little beach that I knew of. It was quite the opposite direction from the cave, and was rather a discovery of mine. I had a ripping bathe there, and I lunched off a tin tongue and 2 tomatoes. And I came back in the afternoon full of confidence and enthusiasm to get on with my sketch. The whole of Rathole seemed to be asleep. I'd been right about the afternoon sunlight. The shadows were far more telling. The Polharwyth Arms was the principal note of my sketch. A ray of sunlight came slanting obliquely down and hit the ground in front of it, and had rather a curious effect. I gathered that the bathing party had returned safely because 2 bathing dresses, a scarlet one and a dark blue one, were hanging from the balcony, drying in the sun. Something had gone a bit wrong with one corner of my sketch, and I bent over it for some moments, doing something to put it right. When I looked up again, there was a figure leaning against one of the pillars of the Polharwyth Arms, who seemed to have appeared there by magic. He was dressed in seafaring clothes and was, I suppose, a fisherman, but he had a long, dark beard. And if I had been looking for a model for a wicked Spanish captain, I couldn't have imagined anyone better. I got to work with feverish haste before he should move away, though from his attitude he looked as though he were perfectly prepared to prop up the pillars through all eternity. He did move, however, but luckily not until I had got what I wanted. He came over to me and began to talk. Oh, how that man talked! Rathole, he said, was a very interesting place. I knew that already, but although I had said so, that didn't save me. I had the whole history of the the destroying, of the village, and how the landlord of the Polharwyth Arms was the last man to be killed, run through on his own threshold by a Spanish captain's sword, and of how his blood spurted out on the pavement, and no one could wash out the stain for 100 years. It all fitted in very well with the languorous, drowsy feeling of the afternoon. The man's voice was very suave, and yet at the same time there was an undercurrent in it of something rather frightening. He was very obsequious in his manner, yet I felt underneath he was cruel. He made me understand the Inquisition and the terrors of all the things the Spaniards did better than I have ever done before. All the time he was talking to me, I went on painting, and suddenly I realized that in the excitement of listening to his story, I'd painted in something that wasn't there. On that white square of pavement, where the sun fell before the door of Polharwyth Arms, I had painted in bloodstains. It seemed extraordinary that the mind could play such tricks with the hand. But as I looked over towards the inn again, I got a second shock. My hand had only painted in what my eyes saw, drops of blood on the white pavement. I stared for a minute or two. Then I shut my eyes and said to myself, "Don't be stupid. There's nothing there really." Then I opened them again, but the blood stains were still there. I suddenly felt I couldn't stand it. I interrupted the fisherman's flood of language. "Tell me," I said, "my eyesight is not very good. Are those blood stains on that pavement?"